Monsignor, faculty and students and friends. I have been away from Minnesota a long time. I should have remembered that you had your one day of summer last week. I also would like to point out, in case you might be curious, as my relatives were when I came in, that I spent a few months in Vietnam, and they were all worried for my personal safety. I wasn't injured till I came back here and tangled with the lawnmower. I'm indeed pleased to have the honor of addressing the faculty and student body of Augsburg College. I was born and reared in Minneapolis, and some of my happiest moments of my boyhood were spent in Boy Scout Troop number 78 at the Church of the Redeemer in North Minneapolis. This Lutheran contact had an indelible impact on my life, and therefore it is with a deep feeling of appreciation that I meet here in a Lutheran setting. During my 18 years in refugee work in Europe and North Africa, I had many contacts with the Lutheran World Federation and the Lutheran Immigration Service. While I do not like to make comparisons between the various voluntary agency groups representing the main faiths who are working with refugees, I can state that the Lutheran agencies stand tall among them. Recently, on my trip to South Vietnam, I spent a few days in Hong Kong and had the pleasure of visiting the splendid vocational school under the able leadership of Pastor Stump and Carl Nielsen that the Lutheran Church has established in that city for Chinese refugee work. I was very happy to learn that Carl Nielsen was a native of the Twin Cities, but unfortunately he went to McAllister, so that took a little off of appreciation. In our Cuban refugee program, the Lutheran Immigration Service, under the direction of my good friend and fellow Minneapolitan, Donald Anderson, has been most helpful in giving leadership as well as financial assistance to the Protestant efforts in Miami to assist in meeting the needs of the Cuban refugees. The federal government is extremely appreciative of this generous and understanding participation of the Lutheran community in the program to relieve Miami area of the impact of the Cuban refugee influx. I realize that my time is limited this morning, but I do want to give you a brief picture of the Cuban refugee program and leave with you some of my impressions of the refugee situation in Vietnam. Elfin Rees of the World Council of Churches often refers to the 20th century as the century of the homeless man. When one realizes how many persons have been uprooted or are being uprooted throughout the world, one can see the validity in Dr. Rees's statement. The United States Committee for Refugees lists some 9.7 million people who are in refugee status at this present moment throughout the world. During the years prior to World War II, I used to participate in the renowned All Nations tournament sponsored by nearby Pillsbury Settlement House. It was the Poles versus the Norwegians, the Italians versus the Swedes, and so forth. That was about the extent of my understanding of international affairs at that time. And I must say I use the word international advisedly. Little did I know that someday I would be in the midst of Poles who were in refugee camps, Ukrainians, Latvians, Germans, Yugoslavs, and the like, living in camps in Europe. Little did I realize that I would be on the Austrian border in 1956, helping thousands of Hungarians to reach Austria. Or then in 1965, I would be in Vietnam, helping refugee work there. It is often said that a refugee votes with his feet. It takes a great deal of courage for a man and his family to walk away from the work of a lifetime. One must leave his home, his furniture, his car, his bank account, his employment, to move off into a strange world among strangers to begin life anew. Why should one make such a drastic decision? The main answer lies in the word freedom. His action is in reply to a government whose actions restrict and suppress his freedom and his right to human dignity. In January 1959, Fidel Castro took over the government of Cuba. People began fleeing to the United States, but the exodus did not grow large until after Castro publicly announced his intentions to follow the Marxist-Lenin line. Thus, in 1960 and 1961, when the schools were taken over and the major firms were nationalized, people began to leave Cuba in large numbers. Prior to October 23, 1962, when the missile crisis brought the daily flights from Cuba to an abrupt halt, refugees were coming out at the rate of 1,700 per week. By the close of 1962, our refugee center in Miami had registered over 154,000 persons. Of this number, nearly 67,000 were receiving financial assistance. The Cuban refugee arrived in a state of destitution, having been stripped of all his assets except for a small amount of clothing. As in all refugee problems, the first phase of any program of refugee aid is to meet the immediate need of food, shelter, clothing, and medical attention. Time will not permit me to go into detail of the complex program that has been developed over the years that has expanded as at the end of fiscal year 1965 has spent some $180 million in the help of assistance to the refugees. Let me touch on a few of the highlights. With so many people crowding into the Miami area, the federal government established a policy of resettlement away from Miami. 4 national voluntary agencies were contracted to furnish resettlement services to the government. By December 1, 1965, nearly 100,000 of the 185,000 registered refugees had been moved to some 3,000 communities in every state of this country, including Alaska. This action, based on the generosity of the American people, working through their churches, synagogues, and community groups, relieved Miami of what could have been a serious conflict of ethnic groups and reduced the financial assistance program from 67,000 to some 14,000. Over 20,000 Cuban school children were in the Miami area in 1962. Imagine what that would mean in our own community of Minneapolis, if 20,000 school students came upon us. Separate schools were not established, but the Miami community accepted these children, 90% of whom could speak no English. During the early years, an additional 13,000 children were sent into the United States by harassed parents who feared communist indoctrination of their children. With the help, again, of Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish child care agencies, these children were placed in care in 41 states. The number has now diminished to less than 900 as parents have been able to leave Cuba on the current airlift. Over 1,700 medical doctors have arrived from Cuba. Our program has sponsored a refresher course at the University of Miami Medical School for these professional men. The majority of them cannot practice because of licensing restrictions, but they can serve in hospitals and institutions under the supervision of an American doctor. Hundreds of Cubans are serving as Spanish language teachers in many schools about the country as a result of having participated in our teacher training programs. On September 28, 1965, Fidel Castro announced that he would permit any person who wished to leave Cuba to do so. President Johnson, in signing the new immigration legislation on October 3, 1965, said that the United States would hold to its traditional position and grant asylum to anyone who sought it. In November, the Swiss Embassy, acting on behalf of the United States, completed a memorandum of understanding with the Cuban government which calls for the orderly movement of Cubans to the United States on the basis of family reunion. Flights were commenced on December 1, 1965, and to date, over 18,000 Cuban refugees have arrived in Miami on the current airlift. Each day we see 200 come in, and I don't think anyone notices it very much, but it is true every day we have 2 planes coming in with 100 refugees on each one. These refugees are processed by our immigration service, registered by the Cuban Refugee Program, and counseled by representatives of the 4 voluntary agencies working with the program. Over 73% of these are moved out of Miami to rejoin their family members in other parts of the country almost immediately. But the important thing, and I think the thing that I want to impress you mostly, is that this is one of the few times in history where a communist country has permitted the orderly flow of its citizens to escape to a so-called capitalistic country. For the benefit of the families which have faced separation for a long time, we hope that the permissive nature of this flow will continue. Our data processing equipment in Miami shows that some 700,000 persons may want to leave Cuba. This will reduce the population of 6 million considerably. However, Castro gains the possessions of the refugees, for they have to give up everything. We gain their skills, and the refugees gain their freedom. And this is about what it is all about. Now, in the few moments remaining, I'd like to give you some of my impressions of the refugee work in Vietnam. I went into South Vietnam in September 1965 to assist in the establishment of a refugee office. Some 650,000 refugees had been identified, but no specific program of assistance had been established either by the South Vietnamese government or by our U.S. aid mission. It was my task to get this work underway. All of you are familiar with the TV reports on the activities in Vietnam, probably too familiar because they usually show the military aspects. It is a most frustrating experience to raise a civilian program in the midst of war, particularly in the midst of a war that has no front. All around there is war, and yet at times one would almost believe that the war could not be happening to a setting as serene as the countryside of Vietnam. You would almost believe that these lovely, gracious people would not be a people who've known war for 25 long years. However, on the civilian side, there is much to be done. There are some 250 refugee camps housing some 400,000 refugees, persons whose houses had been destroyed by bombing or artillery fire, persons who have fled from Viet Cong terror. There are not enough schools or school teachers, not enough medical centers or enough medical personnel, not enough land reform to provide land to those unfortunate farmers who seek only peace and land. But progress is being made in spite of these frustrations. Food, shelter, and clothing are reaching these people. Schools are being built, hospitals are being manned, and the refugee work is truly important, an important means of winning the peace. Vietnam is a very frustrating and complex situation, and one feels as one returns and listens to the debate and so on, a pull from one side to the other. But basically, because my work was with refugees, we have a philosophy where we never ask how a person becomes a refugee. We always ask, is he a refugee and does he need something? And we try to give it to them. In Vietnam, you have various complexities that are difficult for you, I know, as students to follow this. On the religious side, the Buddhist and Catholic friction is a real strong factor. The North Vietnamese, and there are some million North Vietnamese who came down into South Vietnam in 1955 and 56, feel about the South Vietnamese almost like the Prussian feels about the Bavarian, that strong of a difference. There is the complexity of a Chinese, an Indian, a French carryover in the commercial line, where these people are doing business as usual, not even thinking about a war going on. And this creates black market activities, hoarding, and a number of things, and then the real enemy, inflation. And in this whole setting of a war situation, where we have already 250,000 troops, and when one goes into an important airport like Da Nang and so on, you feel as though you're back in D-Day on the English shores. But we all pray and hope that there will be some way that we can stop this thing, because it's like wars, it's useless killing on both sides, and how we will do it, I'm certainly not in position to say, and I wish I were, but somehow it must stop. Thank you very much, President. Thank you.
Do not be deceived, my beloved brethren. Every good endowment and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation